You're lying flat in a hospital bed, machines humming around you as your body refuses your every command. Fingers that once easily turned pages no longer move, and a voice that you once used to teach people around the world has fallen silent. Yet imagine this, you still manage to write an extraordinary book, not using pen and paper, not by tapping on a screen or a keyboard. You do it in the only workspace that you have left, your memory. This is what Tony Judt did. He was a historian, a linguist, a professor, a writer, a man dismantled by the disease ALS, but someone still capable of writing this one final masterpiece, The Memory Chalet, an extraordinary book. Now, this is not a book review. It is an investigation and a revelation of some of the most extraordinary learning techniques and attitudes that are in this book. Pure gold and a survival manual at the end of the day for lifelong learners who are struggling. Inside this book are lessons on grit, how to pick up multiple languages, and how to use the architecture of memory itself. Methods that you can use while you still have time. So I'm going to excavate from these pages revelation after revelation, because Judt reshaped one of history's oldest learning techniques in a way that many people need to do in order to get into it. And on the way to this amazing revelation, there are some things that may seem a little bit trivial, but please pay attention, because I'm going to explain why the various points that leapt out at me are so profound and will change your understanding of the mind itself. And as always, I've brought the science to prove it, even if the dust cover here is falling apart a little bit on me. But stick with me, because this is powerful stuff, especially if you've ever struggled to take action. Imagine someone being able to still write a book with no body at their command anymore at all. That's grit. And the person who can do that has lessons that we can all learn from. Let's go. Judt writes something so profound early on in The Memory Chalet, it hit me like a sledgehammer. He says that nostalgia makes a very satisfactory second home. But think about how many times we're told to distrust the past, to stop romanticizing it. Oh, you're just being nostalgic. Well, Judt built entire essays of pure gold by being nostalgic, revisiting childhood landscapes, going through school corridors to share with us the story of one teacher in particular who helped him master language learning, not just one language, but multiple languages. And Judt, when he was no longer able to write notes with his hands, he used memory as a kind of writing desk. And for him, nostalgia was not a trap. It was a tool and an architecture. And that's a lesson that is very, very important. Do not dismiss your past. Use it. Turn those old houses and old streets into a second home for your thoughts. When nostalgia is used optimally, it's not an escape. It's construction. And I want to really focus on that word construction, because Judt wrote this book when his body was undergoing deconstruction. Now, he says in The Memory Chalet that he was not experiencing any physical suffering, but there's some psychological suffering that leaps out at me from between the lines. And I don't want to impose it on him, but he is looking at the worlds that he used to inhabit, one of which was giving television appearances to talk about his work as a historian and as a public intellectual. And he watched the multimedia worlds that he played a crucial role in change into something that also caused clear psychological suffering based on the way he criticizes it. He's watching people scroll through infinite feeds on infinite internet platforms. And this is another profound little nugget. he just lays out this damning criticism in one skilled sentence I wish I could write so well. He says, sometimes the performer draws more attention than the subject. This is so right. It's right also because of the skill in the sentence. He uses this word sometimes. Now, let me take what might seem like a little rabbit hole here, but as a historian and a language learner, I think Judt probably knew Juvenal's very famous line about panem et circenses, bread or games. And this is a biting criticism that Juvenal made when he observed that politicians and their people that helped them did many outlandish things during the heights of Rome to generate public approval. So when Judt is talking about this performance taking over the subject, well, back in Rome, it was not excellence in public service or public policy, but it was diversion, distraction that satisfied so many people. It was circuses instead of bread that were given to satisfy the requirements of the populace. So in Juvenal, the whole sentence is worth quoting. Juvenal writes, already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses. So sometimes is a word that matters because Judt knows that it's hardly new for spectacle to devour the substance. But he didn't reject the performance. He valued it, and he performs himself, especially performance in the service of learning. So he had this teacher that he resurrects for us in a chapter called Joe. And this Joe character taught German, and he was quite a character. Students dreaded this guy. And Judt actually thrived under that terror. He took the performance and found the substance in it. And the rigor helped to force mastery. It literally drove Judt to want to show up to class prepared with declensions in German. And I've learned German, and they're pretty challenging. Joe gave Judt this mental model that made him want to be tough through learning the language by actually showing up to avoid the hard criticism. He chose the bread instead of the circus, and he wound up learning multiple languages, and that grit later helped him learn Czech. And then later when he had ALS and it was pinning his body down, that grit instilled by these harsh teachers kept him writing, even though he couldn't use his hands. So soft teachers, as they sometimes say, make soft students. Tough teachers can, not always, but they can create thinkers who endure. Now, to tie it back to nostalgia, the point is that we are losing our memory, and there was a time in education where it was just normal to remember a lot of things. And so whether you agree or disagree with the idea that we need to bring back some toughness in learning, I would love to hear from you, and smash that thumbs up just for learning in general, and get subscribed right now if you're new here. You're not just watching part of the Magnetic Memory Method mission to restore the grit of real education in the way that Judt is talking about. We're trying to raise all ships by having the discussion in the first place and focusing on the truth about what we really need as self-directed learners, which may be a bit of nostalgia for the performance that leads us to seek substance. Because the whole thing about Joe the teacher is that guy, Joe, at least as he's described in the Memory Chalet, was authentic, and he gave Judt and other students an authentic shot at getting what you want in life, which is mastery over multiple things. Not just a jack of all trades or a dabbler in this, that, and the other thing where you just have rubble in your hands because you can't remember a thing, but an actual foundational depth that deepens and deepens and deepens more over time. And Judt, very interestingly, called himself in this book an isolated autodidact. He did teach himself languages, or at least he learned them on his own as an adult. However, he did it in the true autodidactic fashion by never doing it alone entirely. So when he taught himself Czech as an adult, for example, he surrounded himself by what he called linguists of talent. And even with the vast majority of his learning being in solitude, he sought out friction by being around people who were better than him at the language, other minds, other voices. And he helped the language stick that way. So what does that mean practically? Well, too many people isolate themselves with apps or books. They never put themselves in a room where they can be wrong, they can be corrected, and then they run away from the opportunity of having their skills sharpened by taking those risks. But Judt proves that you need those other people. Autodidacts who lock themselves away, they don't last. The real ones who succeed, they design communities around their learning. So even though a lot of language learning is a solo activity, there's no doubt about it, you got to put yourself into the rooms with native speakers and other language learners who are better than you. I learned this truth the hard way myself. For many years, I dabbled with German. I took courses in it at York University, and I slowly translated Kafka while grinding through boring textbooks, and I made some progress. But nothing clicked. Everything changed, though, when I joined a German metal band called The Outside. And my bandmates, they all knew English, and the lyrics in The Outside were all English, and I edited some of them so they sounded a little more English. But one day, I realized that I needed to force myself to speak German with my bandmates, even if they kept speaking English back to me. Because, hey, they wanted to practice my language and get better at English as a mother tongue. And this is a thing that language learners have to fight with all the time. And, it's awkward sometimes, but you just got to insist. And then you got to ask for feedback. And you know what? It was awkward in the beginning. It was broken, stumbling German. But it was German nonetheless. And they were linguists of talent, as Judt puts it, that beautiful phrase, linguists of talent. And in order to maximize that exposure, I learned German songs so I could sing them backstage and make the other bands laugh. And, I would try to learn the most obscure songs. Wenn ich mir was wünschen dürfte, käme ich in Verlegenheit. Like, it's pretty obscure. And they would laugh at me and they'd be like, what? And then I would, oh yeah, that's Marlene Dietrich and so forth. And then in order to have even more things to say, I would look up interviews with my favorite musicians, sometimes interviews with the bands that we were on tour with, and I would memorize cool phrases, and that material was very, very important. I don't know exactly how I landed on the idea, but interviews with other musicians thrilled me. Einstürzen und Neubauten, mind-blowing stuff. And I would just pick up the most amazing phrases. And because they were not boring, and then I could use them with these native speakers and blow them away because they're like, where the heck did you come up with that, right? It was constantly thrilling. And another thing that I did is I set a rule for myself. Now, I was a film studies professor at the time as well as a bass player. So I watched a lot of movies in English. I had to. It was for my job. But this rule is that any movie that wasn't for my job, it was either a German movie or it was a movie with German subtitles on or the German overdub on. And so from Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan to The Tudors, night after night during my free time movie viewing, I would write down these cool phrases. And then in the day, I would spend a little bit of time memorizing directly from a German dictionary. And this gave me the rhythms of real language, but I had to also speak it frequently with native speakers. So this isn't traditional classroom learning. I tried that with German and the results were minimal. But the big lesson here, at the risk of repetition to really drive it home, is it's not about isolation. It's about social reinforcement. And it's autodidactic, what Judt is saying here, in the truest sense. You design your own system. And that's very, very important. Even if you want to improve your mother tongue, you can benefit from creating your own program and then getting out there and challenging yourself to use these words that are unusual and strange in public with people who are skilled linguists. So push yourself into the friction. Judt did it. I did it. Every successful language learner I know did it. And I know some of the most famous polyglots personally. And they've helped me so much by sharing exactly what I just shared with you. And I was delighted to find it in this book. So the other angle here is just learning in general. And there's a really interesting phrase that Judt uses, which is methodological solipsism. I love this word, solipsism. In case it's new to you, there's actually two kinds, hard solipsism and soft solipsism. Either way, it's this kind of illusion that you live all by yourself. You're the only person who exists. And I don't think he's using it in either of those ways, but he's getting at the idea that you can't learn in a vacuum. But a lot of people think that they can. You cannot. Every time that I launch an autodidact video or something about self-learning, people think they're being clever by writing in the comments and saying, oh, yeah, Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, he didn't teach himself or herself a thing. That's just not possible. Einstein never taught himself, blah, blah, blah. No. That's not what autodidacticism is about. It's about crafting learning programs for yourself that put you in contact with the best possible teachers based on your circumstances at the time of learning. So you're not solipsistic. You're not the only person who exists in the world. And we do have a time in which some scholars seem to act as if they are learning and teaching and living in a vacuum, but we call it an echo chamber these days. You might not know this if you don't get a PhD like I did back in the day. When I was in grad school, the term intellectual incest was thrown around quite a lot, and I was warned against it. Whatever you do, don't ever make it seem like you are guilty of intellectual incest. And it was something that people avoided. I went and got a second MA at another university in order to have that cross-fertilization, But these days, a lot of people are not doing that. They're solitary scholars, and they live in these echo chambers. They're never challenged. They don't challenge their ideas with other people at other schools, and they're often becoming puritanical rather than intellectual. And Judt goes into this through his own career and tracks the history of how this happened. And he avoided the problem through movement. When he could still use his legs, he lived in multiple cities. He worked in multiple cultures. And as mentioned, he learned multiple languages. But this is a key thing. Constant relocation shattered the echo chambers, and it popped the bubbles. And he got challenged all the time. And it inoculated him against the fragility that he saw as the rise of the internet led to hypersensitivity. But the weird thing about the Puritanism that has arisen is that it has come to be mixed with callous indifference. So there's outrage everywhere, but empathy nowhere. There's false empathy. But, whether you're striving to be an intellectual person or just a self-taught individual who learns languages and so forth, don't collapse into yourself. You're going to become brittle. And this is where memory itself comes in loud and clear. Now, you've probably heard the term memory palace before, and you might be wondering, well, why the heck isn't this called the memory palace? It's called the memory chalet. Well, he's definitely talking about the ancient technique called the memory palace, but here's the catch. Even brilliant people sometimes get overwhelmed, and the word palace felt too vast for Judt, too imperial, and he decided that he wasn't going to reject the method, so he re-engineered it. And instead of a memory palace, he built a memory chalet, a human-sized, modest little space that he could actually inhabit during the last months of his life. And when he learned something new and he wanted to memorize it, he used a memory chalet instead of a memory palace. Now, this might seem silly, but that small adjustment was not cosmetic, and it wasn't silly at all. It helped him rewire how his brain processed memory. And cognitive scientists call it predictive processing. And you can read The Experience Machine by Andy Clark to learn all about how the mind tests the models that you hand it. And when you change the model, you can change how the system runs. And another beautiful book to read is The Hidden Spring that gets even deeper into it. And it has a lot to do, if memory serves, with a part of the brain called para-aqueductal gray. And I love how often that term comes up here. But I had to memorize it, and I had to use a memory palace in order to memorize it. But this is why Judt's memory chalet worked when he felt that the idea of the memory palace was too overwhelming. He shrunk the actual overwhelm by giving it a different term. This gave his brain permission to use the technique anyway. And out of that came a book that outlived his body. I've seen this simple choice to change the terms and the metaphors help so many people, including myself, so many times over the years. This peri-aqueductal gray, man, it just needs sometimes a different word. One of my students, 88 years old, he hated the term memory palace. He also thought it felt too grandiose, and in his case, it was too abstract. So I said, well, what happens if you change the term? What would you come up with? And he said, I'm going to call it apartments with compartments. And suddenly, it just clicked for him. The mysteries of the human mind just, I don't know, like it just worked because of these principles that scientists know about and this predictive processing. If you keep feeling like it's hard because the term makes it feel hard to you, it's going to keep being hard. So one of the things that Judt makes very, very clear is that you can break the rules when you know the rules. So he had this foundational grit. But also when this moment of, let's call it weakness came and he felt overwhelmed by a technique, he knew to just change the term, and then he was able to use it to capture and remember key details. And the best part is that if you work on developing these foundational skills and you start to add more skills by learning more languages, learning how to write and express yourself really well, learning how to present on media like Judt did, to be a rhetorician, to be persuasive, and so forth, you're going to wind up having more and more grit. And when things happen, because inevitably they are going to happen, hopefully, knock on wood, nothing like ALS, but you're going to be able to push through. And well, again, it's scientifically backed up. There's a study in 1972 by Fergus and Craik, and they described what's called the levels of processing effect. Deeper engagement with reading, writing, speaking, listening, reflective thinking produces stronger memory traces than shallow exposure ever will. So Judt did exactly that. He didn't rely in his language learning, for example, on comprehensible input the way, Stephen Krashen talks about. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think this is just at another level. He rotated and interleaved between all these different activities. He wrote, he spoke, he listened, he thought deeply, he got his mouth open in challenging situations with people who were better than him at language learning, and then he got language learning mastery, and it helped with his historical clarity because as a historian, you want to be able to learn and know other languages. So when it comes to this predictive processing, this is an example of it in action. His mind is rehearsing possible futures, possible sentences he might want to speak, possible arguments and counter-arguments, and just constantly testing them against his memory in a way that strengthened memory. And then when he couldn't take notes anymore, well, he found this weakness and he knew what to do. It wasn't just that he's going to imagine that he had this strength. He structured a way of getting into the technique by just simply changing the names of the game. And this has to do with identity. He reshaped his identity through the use of language, but then he used place And the place was this small little room that he was in. And so he moved from being a historian of Europe to a historian of memory itself as the ALS closed in. Now, I have had health problems, of course, everybody has, and I've had recent challenges where I had to re-engineer my own metaphors in order to keep going. You may notice that I'm in a new studio. Well, quite frankly, I didn't want to move. And I nearly abandoned my second memory detective novel, Vitamin X, which I'm very happy to show you. I'm holding here today because I succeeded in pushing through. But this intense period of personal problems that really were no fault of my own, but became very personal, required me to reframe my identity. And I couldn't, say, oh, well, I'm stuck as a writer, or, I'm being a perfectionist, or, I just want to give up. All this sort of stuff. I just had to edit the metaphors in real time. And I believe it's constant memory training that helped me have the grit. It's the foundations of having gone through learning languages, because I too had tough language learning teachers. And, it all comes together. And I'm not caught in perfectionism right now because this version, this copy, it's not sized quite right. And so it's looking awkward. But I almost wanted to just give up when I saw that it wasn't sized correctly. I was just like, oh, do I have to talk to the designer again? Well, I changed the metaphor. So I use a lot of little mantras. I've shared them before with you in a video called 5 Personal Mantras that instantly create inner harmony and are easy to remember. I recommend that you check them out. And now, here we are. Like, I've emailed the people. We're going to get a different cover going for it. I didn't feel like it because I'm really worn down by what happened and having to deal with this new studio and so forth. But I want to, I'll tell you one of the metaphors that I use. Tony Judt, one of my mentors, he used this term, the warrior of the mind. He even gave me the warrior of the mind emblem, which was one of his brain cells. I'll never forget him taking it off his lapel and putting it on mine. Those of you who know the memory world, you know that pin appears in Joshua Foer's Moonwalking with Einstein, a great history book, really, about memory techniques and so forth. And I thought of that, and I thought, I have to push through. This looks like crap, but I have to be a warrior of the mind so that I can get it out there. Even though I didn't really feel like it, I felt like just giving up. So these manageable metaphors, if you can catch them and you can change them, this is how polymaths, autodidacts survive setbacks. And it's so helpful to remember that your identity is not fixed. You can learn new tricks, but you have to shift the mind. And it's so much easier to do when you're a committed lifelong learner who uses memory techniques. Constantly train your memory, whether it's the magnetic memory method or something else. Train your memory daily, because it's going to give you the ability to have radical metacognition. You're going to catch yourself when you're stuck in a negative loop, and you're going to become a warrior of the mind because you're going to catch it and you're going to change it. So should you read The Memory Chalet? Well, look, I think it's a masterpiece of facing unimaginable pain. Yes, he says he didn't feel physical pain. I think he must have gone through psychological terror. And he does talk a little bit about that terror, but I think he's a very, very good writer, and he's focused on the point, which I'm not always good at. But, you can learn a lot just about what good writing is from reading this book. And he leaves you a model for anyone serious about learning. And there are stern warnings I think we all need to pay attention to, not just about being little sensitive flowers, but what's happening with education and what's not happening with education. So I hope everyone keeps coming back to these deep dives, whether you read the books that I recommend to you or not. And for those of you who keep coming back to these videos, thank you. It's the regulars like yourself that make this channel more than just content. You're part of a movement to help restore the tough, resilient, joyful art of learning. And I try my best to perform, but not at the expense of having content that actually has meat on its bones. Now, I sometimes joke about meat, and I used to in the old days talk about meat, MEAT, meaningless edutainment, absurdly thriving on the internet. It seems like it's absurdly thriving even more now that the robots are creating content. But that's all the more reason why I want to take this time to thank you, and especially in this case, to Lila, who emailed and mentioned that she was reading The Memory Chalet, and she was mentioning also a pretty interesting conversation I may get to have one of these days, and I hope that I do. And until that happens, if you want a structured way to put some of the lessons from Judt's book into place, yes, I do recommend that you read it. But I also recommend that you take these lessons and learn how to remember them, but structure your life using the self-education blueprint at magneticmarionmethod.com/SEB for self-education blueprint. It's free. It's an entry point to everything I teach, and it gives you an actual plan for being polymathic, for being an autodidact, a true autodidact who puts together a learning program and gets one foundational thing done so you can add on the next and the next and the next. If you want to learn how to use memory palaces or memory chalets or apartments with compartments, well, stick around and watch my detailed video on the memory palace technique for studying next, and do it while you can. Because as Tony Judt reminds us, time is always running out. You don't know when you're going to lose your hands. You don't know when you're going to lose your life. You don't know when you're going to lose the ability to be a warrior of the mind and change those metaphors so that your life can serve up the miracles that you deserve. And always remember that the metaphors that can serve us can also tear us apart. And sometimes people say, oh, one day I'll do it, or I'll get to it someday. Well, someday never comes. So master this technique now. Taking the opportunity while you have the chance worked for Judt, and it will work for you too. So thanks again. And until we speak again, watch that video on mastering the Memory Palace technique for studying, and keep yourself magnetic.